Thank you and good evening. For the radio audience, I've just placed a teapot and a teacup on the lectern. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you to our host, the Rosencrantz Foundation, to NPR. Thank you also to thank all of you for coming, and thank you to the opposing team for what I know will be a well-articulated argument for something we all wish were true. Unfortunately, it is not. I am here tonight to argue for the motion that Russia is becoming our enemy again. I'd like to begin with a few definitions. Russia is an enormous polity encompassing more than 140 million people, 11 time zones, and a multitude of views. I'm sure that many people in this room are personally acquainted with Russians who are by no means our enemies. But inside Russia, their views count for less and less. And in speaking of Russia, we must speak of the increasingly authoritarian state, and speaking of Russia in this debate tonight, the increasingly authoritarian Russian state of President Putin, of the security apparatus, and the chief and increasingly centralized and authoritarian centers of power. Another definition I'd like to just get into quickly, it's important, is enemy. The American Heritage Dictionary, which seems appropriate tonight, defines enemy as, quote, one who manifests malice or hostility toward or opposes the purposes or interests of another, a foe, an opponent. Finally, no one is here tonight to argue that Russia is right now our enemy. The motion up for debate is that Russia is becoming our enemy again. It is that direction, that becoming, that trajectory which we are here to debate. For two benchmarks, I would like to share with you a memory of a dinner in Moscow more than a decade ago. It was with someone who has experienced then and since firsthand Russia's trajectory, not at a distance, but has been living it. He was then optimistic. It was a dinner with a number of journalists, and despite our worries, he assured us that all would be well, that Russia was heading in a good direction, that Russians could get rich doing honest business. His name was Garry Kasparov. Today, Mr. Kasparov has been pouring forth articles and giving interviews in the West, warning us that Russia is becoming, indeed has become, a criminal petrostate. The model, he tells us, is not the old czarist autocracy, but the godfather, the mafia. He wants to run in the presidential election next March, but what he recently told MSNBC is that we're not, quote, we're not fighting to win elections, we're fighting to have elections. Okay, that may be bad for Russia, but does it mean that Russia's government is becoming America's enemy? Yes, we live in an age when governments tend to export their creeds, methods, and technologies, and techniques, excuse me. And I'd like to just invite you for a minute to engage in a little imaginary experiment, that you are a Russian Democrat, a patriot, trying to warn the free world that Russia is becoming an increasingly dangerous police state. Let's say you're investigating the murder of a journalist and you meet in a city, say London, with an emissary of the Kremlin. You have every right to the question you wish to ask. Tea is served. Would you, without a second thought these days, drink that tea? This is a picture of Alexander Litvinenko, who drank it. He's here on his deathbed. These are the effects of polonium-210 on the human body. The Kremlin denies anything to do with it. This is a picture of Viktor Yushchenko during his successful bid for the presidency of the Ukraine over the Kremlin's objections. These are the effects of dioxin on the human face. The Kremlin denies anything to do with it. To get to the bottom of such stories, can we turn to the Russian media? No, not likely. They've been murdered, harassed, taken over. Again, the trajectory in the early 90s, when that optimistic dinner with Garry Kasparov took place, Russia had a lively press. You could quarrel with what they wrote, but they could say what they wanted to. The shutdowns and takeovers since then, and I include a very partial list, NTV, the independent TV station, ORT, all sort of co-opted by government forces, the Newsweekly Itogi, Sivonia, TV6, Kommersant, the list goes on. The broad narrative over this time is that there have been phases and steps forward and back to this direction that the Russian government is taking. But the broad arc is that in the early 1990s, everything was up for grabs. The rules, the property, the whole thing, it was being sorted out. At this point, the shakeout has largely taken place. What do we see? The government has effectively reabsorbed the revenues coming from such oil and gas giants as Yukos and Gazprom. We've seen the murdering of journalists. We've seen the targeting of businessman Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who wanted to engage on Western terms with Western business. We've seen the increasing control over the regions. We've seen the rising charade of elections with President Putin now suggesting he might want to stay on as prime minister. Again, the rise of the authoritarian state. Again, does this make Russia our enemy? Yes, and the reason why is governments such as this need enemies to justify what they do, to deflect anger and frustrations, to show that they are important and necessary. And in Russia in the sense of those who now rule, in Russia's quest to do that, the real rival is the US. And following sort of the initial and conditional cooperation we saw in a sort of sunny phase just after September 11th, even that was problematic, Russia's government has become increasingly hostile and confrontational. If I run out of time, my colleagues are going to cover more for you, but let's give a few examples. Putin's polarizing speech in February in Munich, accusing the U.S. of, quote, singling out the U.S., of forcing its will on the world, and accusing the U.S. of undermining international security. Quote, one state, the United States, has overstepped its national borders in every way, he said. You can find a great many more examples of states. You can argue about U.S. policy, but he was directing this at the U.S. for the world to hear. According to a recent statement by the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Russia now spies on the U.S. nearly as much as during the Cold War. The difficulties raised for nearby states, which are inclined to be friendliest to the U.S., including lobbing a missile into Georgia, fiddling with gas supplies to the Ukraine, waging cyber war in Estonia, and finally Iran, where Russia has spent more than a decade over U.S. protests transferring nuclear technology, and at the UN in Security Council efforts to do something about this has been one of the prime obstacles, watering down resolutions, objecting, signing only when
1 minute.
It couldn't really do much more. Oil prices, Russia has every interest in keeping those high, roiling the Middle East, making trouble that is inimical to U.S. interests. 6 years ago, President Bush looked into President Putin's eyes and thought he saw a friend of the United States of America, if only. What we have been learning since then, as Russia charts its course, its direction of becoming, is that in America's dealings with the Kremlin, it is wiser, as with any antagonist, foe, opponent, enemy in the making, to watch your back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Claudia Rosett.